Chapter 3: Matter, Energy, and Life. All life is composed of matter, and all living things use energy. Therefore, we must understand how these things move or cycle through natural systems to better understand the interactions between living things. This chapter attempts to define and explain the relationship between both. For many scientific words, we base them off of Latin or Greek terms. For example, biology is derived from the root word bios and logos. Bios means life and logos means logic. Therefore, biology is the study of living things. Ecology also has the Latin root logos, but what does ecos mean? Ecos is derived from the Latin word for home. So simply put, ecology means to understand how your home works. In the context of science, though, home means your environment or surroundings. Therefore, ecologists try to understand the relationships between living and non-living things in the environment. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. All living things, then, are composed of matter. Matter is constrained by the law of conservation of matter, which simply says matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change in its form. In layman's terms, it means when I eat a burrito, I cannot really destroy the matter in that burrito, but I can convert it into another form, me. This is tightly linked to the laws of thermodynamics we will discuss next. Energy is the capacity to do work. Because it is the capacity to do work, it is important to realize it doesn't always do work at all times. Energy can be stored for later work. This means you can have kinetic energy, energy doing work, or potential energy, stored energy waiting to do work. A good example is the fuel in your car's tank. Sitting in your drive, the energy in the fuel is potential energy. It has the potential to make your car move. It is also chemical energy because the energy is stored in the chemical bonds of the fuel. Once you start the car and the engine is on, that potential energy is now rapidly being converted to kinetic energy. In other words, it is now doing work. Now, as most of us know, when the engine is running, it gets hot. That illustrates an important point regarding energy. Like matter, it also cannot be created or destroyed. However, we can change its form. When we do this, oftentimes the majority of the energy is converted to heat, a very low-level form of energy. The study of the transfer of energy from one form to another is called thermodynamics. It is important to note that energy can only flow within a system. This has serious implications for Earth. Our ultimate energy source is the sun. Energy from the sun must flow to Earth and then from the Earth back into space. Living things are critical to this flow, but are constrained by two main laws: the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law is simply the conservation of matter stated regarding energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change its form. However, the second law states that as we change the form of the energy, less energy is available to the next successive level. Why is this important in the context of living things on Earth? It implies that we have to have a constant supply of energy to maintain our biological systems. This is because if we don't continually supply energy, the system will become less and less organized. This is the law of entropy, and it happens all the time. Just think of your room or house and how it looks if you don't supply energy to keep it clean. As mentioned earlier, the source of energy for the Earth is the sun. How does that energy, solar, get converted into a form living things can use? Chemical. The answer is plants. Plants link the energy of the sun to almost all other living things. They do this via photosynthesis, which converts the energy of the sun into glucose. Ultimately, the energy of the sun is stored in the chemical bonds found in this very simple sugar. Energy for life. Of all solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface, about 10% is ultraviolet, 45% is visible, and 45% is infrared. Most of this energy is absorbed by land or water, or reflected back into space. Only about 1 to 2% of the sunlight falling on plants is captured for photosynthesis. One interesting aspect of the energy of the sun is it isn't discrete. It occurs across a broad spectrum of wavelengths. As you can see from the graph, the sun releases energy not only as light we can see, the visible spectrum, but also as gamma and X-rays, as well as microwaves and radio waves. However, plants exclusively use the visible spectrum of light for photosynthesis. They do this by producing pigments that capture the solar energy and convert it to chemical energy. Ironically enough, when you look at a plant and see a color, that is the color of the visible spectrum that is not being used. Instead, it is being reflected back, which is why we can see it. As we mentioned earlier, plants link solar energy to other living things via photosynthesis. Simply put, plants convert water and carbon dioxide into glucose and oxygen. Note in the equation that no matter is created or destroyed, it just changes its form. In other words, while we might be converting carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen, the amount of hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen is exactly the same on both sides of the equation. This illustration demonstrates photosynthesis. While photosynthesis converts sunlight to glucose and oxygen, cellular respiration is just the opposite. It converts glucose into water and carbon dioxide while giving off energy. That energy released is what animals and other living things use to do work. This means that photosynthesis and cellular respiration is linked in all living things. An illustration of energy exchange in ecosystems. Now that we have a basic understanding of energy, we need to discuss the process or movement of that energy through nature. Just like how we organize living things by categories and characteristics, we do the same with systems. At the lowest level of organization is the species. Ernest Mayr provided the modern definition we use for species. As you can see, a species is just all the members of the same kind that can interbreed and produce viable offspring. At the next level is the population. The only difference between species and populations is the addition of location. A population is all of the members of a species in a given area or range. A community is simply all of the populations in that given area. These two terms are often confused and interchanged with each other, so be cognizant of the difference. If we look at all the living and non-living components of the system in that same area, we have not defined a biome or ecosystem. Biomes are characterized not just by the living things, but also by abiotic components such as average temperature and precipitation, climate. The last level of organization is the biosphere, or Earth. From species to ecosystems. An ecosystem is a biological community in its physical environment. The physical environment includes non-living factors such as climate, water, minerals, sunlight. It is difficult to define the boundaries of an ecosystem. Most ecosystems are open in that they exchange materials and organisms with other ecosystems. Within a population or community, movement of energy is accomplished by feeding. How much is available is limited by the amount of sunlight converted to chemical energy by photosynthesis. Because of this, we can separate living things into producers and consumers. In this context, plants are producers, specifically primary producers since they are at the bottom, and animals would be consumers. Productivity is just a measure of the amount of biomass produced in a given area. Remember, living things take sunlight and converts it into a chemical compound. That energy is then used to grow and reproduce. Productivity measures that rate of growth. Before we talk about the linkage of energy flow in a system, we need to talk about energy or feeding levels. At a simple level, living things are either autotrophs, self-feeders, or heterotrophs, other feeders. Plants are autotrophs while animals are heterotrophs. The word trough simply means feeding. Therefore, when we talk about feeding levels, we are talking about trophic levels. Because energy moves through the system by feeding, we can trace the flow using either a food chain or a food web. Food chains are very simple flows of energy with very little variation at each level of eating. Food webs, on the other hand, are very complex and can have many different individual species at a trophic level. For example, not only do birds eat seeds, but so do mice and insects. That means at the seed-eating level, there are multiple players. Those seed eaters then become food for things at the next level. Coyotes eat the insects, but they also eat mice. So, if we trace the flow of energy to the coyote, there would be multiple lines connecting to the next lower level. That would be an example of a food chain. Food chains are much more stable in a system because of the ability for consumers to eat across many different species at the next lower level. If you killed all the insects, the coyotes could still eat mice. An illustration of a food web. The feeding or trophic levels within a system are typically named after the primary type of consumption by that type of organisms. For example, plant eaters are herbivores, while animals that eat the grass are carnivores. Trophic levels: 1. Producers. 2. Primary consumers. 3. Secondary consumers. 4. Tertiary consumers. An illustration of a food web with trophic levels. How do we link trophic levels with the law of thermodynamics? Because energy is moved through the system by eating, and because the transfer from level to level is not 100%, the second law and law of entropy, we know the energy transferred is reduced drastically. As a rule of thumb, approximately 90% of energy is lost as heat or in the cost of doing business, leaving only 10% available to the next level to work and reproduce. The outcome of this is that the amount of available energy decreases from a wide base to a small peak. This reduction causes the formation of an energy pyramid as you move up the trophic levels. What implication does this have? Ultimately, the number of trophic levels is limited. Because of this energy loss, at some point, there is enough energy available to support the next higher level. Ultimately, the number of trophic levels is limited because of this energy loss, because at some point there is enough energy available to support the next higher level. A rule of thumb is that most pyramids are limited by 4 trophic levels. An illustration of energy loss within a food chain. An illustration of the energy pyramid. The last thing I want to discuss are nutrient cycles. While energy flows in a system because of the sun, earth, space linkage for energy, nutrients are limited to what we have on earth at this time, meaning nutrients cycle. The main nutrients discussed in the text are water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. To illustrate nutrient cycling, only phosphorus is covered in these slides, but you will be responsible for the other main nutrients. The main thing to notice is that there is source for the phosphorus, a cycling of the phosphorus, and then a subsequent sink for the phosphorus. This source to sink pathway is true of the other nutrients as well. An illustration of the phosphorus cycle.